Welcome, everybody. Kind of lost count on what week we're at. I think it's week 44 or week 45. But great to see everybody here today, wherever you are in the world. One thing we're trying to do, it's like a minhag of the Habura now, is for people to put into the chat the city that they're in right now, because it's always nice to know the broad array of Talmidim and Talmidot that we have from around the world. Quick housekeeping as usual. Membership mode was supposed to be launched this week, but we've had some additional exciting news which has forced us to delay membership mode by 1 week because it required some extra preparation. So be prepared for the launch with the curriculum next week, please God, as well as a launch video that, as I mentioned on last week's call, that we shot. And really, really excited to present it all to you. Now, this week's Chabura, we're honored to welcome back Professor Zvi Zohar. I call him Hacham Zvi Zohar. I know many people in the group call him Hacham Zvi. Professor Zohar, as we know, he studied 3 years at Markaz Harav Yeshiva. One of the leading authorities on the classical Sephardi approach. His book that many of us have spoken about in the discussion group, and we're planning to offer as one of the free books for members from July. Really influenced a lot of us, an array of sources on rabbinic creativity in the modern Middle East, a really important book on classical Sephardi thought and practice. Formerly professor of Sephardic law at Bar Ilan University, and tonight we'll be touching upon a Hacham that was one of the greatest Hachamim of 19th century era, really, Hacham Israel Moshe Chazan, somebody who doesn't get enough attention. And tonight we'll dig into a very important topic with regards to our relation as Jews with non-Jews and non-Jewish culture. I think it's an often misunderstood or often misconceived area of both halakha and thought. So I'm very excited to have Professor Zohar, Hacham Zohar, here tonight with us. So Professor, B'chavod, the stage is yours.
Okay, I don't know to say good evening, good morning. I see that we have people from Australia, so who knows where we are, somewhere in the universe. And this meeting is one of 2 meetings. I think the next one is in 2 weeks from now, which is going to be devoted to a certain teshuvah written by Rav Yisrael Moshe Chazan. And I've been rereading it and going over it and preparing the material over the past few days, and I realized that there's no way we're going to actually get through all of this material in 2 sessions, but we will have more than a taste of the way Rav Yisrael Moshe Chazan deals with issues and how he thinks. And he was born in 1808 and passed away in the beginning of 1863, I believe. And so this teshuvah is from 1848, meaning he was exactly 40 years old. And at the time, he was the chief rabbi of the Jewish community of Rome, which at that time was still in the area of the ghetto. And he explains at the beginning of this teshuvah that people weren't coming on time to Bet Knesset, and therefore he made up for them a very detailed table of, we have Shaot Zemaniot, so the noon shifts according to the regular clocks, and so he made a table for this, which is translated into Italian, but this didn't really work. And then he had the idea that if there would be in the central area where they had 5 Batei Knesset all gathered together, if they would be able to have tower, and on the top of it a big clock, and the clock would strike the hours and the quarter hours and so on, and everybody in the ghetto would be able to hear it. Nobody would be able to say that they didn't realize it was time for tefillah. So he suggested that they should do this, whereupon the Gabbaim of the synagogue said that's a very nice idea. It would probably be very useful. However, you know, we're in the city of Rome, and quite a few churches have such towers outside them with clocks that strike the hour. And you know that in churches, what do they strike the hour with? They have bills. Part of the system, they have bills, and you know that the bills in the church are part of the church tradition and religion, and therefore wouldn't it be a problem vis-a-vis Hukot HaGoyim, the ways or the norms of the nations, for us to have such a tower and with a clock and striking the hour with bells in our synagogue? And this teshuvah presents itself as, somebody's waiting to get into the, so this teshuvah presents itself as a response to that question. As we shall see, in order to answer that question, he needed about what turns out to be about maybe 20% of the teshuvah, or even less. And this teshuvah, he takes the opportunity to address in general major issues of Chukot HaGoyim, which was, I think, just in the past Parashat Shavua, and Chukotehem lo telechu, right? And this phrase has become, rightly so, as Chazal developed it, a motto for the idea that in some circles, that if the Goyim do A, we have to do the opposite. We certainly shouldn't do A because we are like Am Levadad Yishkon, people that dwells alone, and therefore we should not be doing what the Goyim do. And Rabbi Moshe Chazan realized that, and this is what he takes up in this teshuvah, which also has other interesting aspects. So I would like now to share the screen with you. Some of you may have also the text itself before you. In any case, okay, so here we are. And okay, so this is the Kerach Shel Romi. It was not printed in his lifetime, but was printed by his nephew, who at that time was a rabbi in Libya, in Tripoli, Eliyahu Chazan, who was an interesting, very interesting rabbi in his own right. Okay, so at this time, I think it was 1876 that it was published. Eliyahu Chazan, who was a relative of his, was Rosh Mata v'Reish Metivta v'Ir v'Em b'Yisrael Terablus HaMa'arav, Tripoli of the West, because Tripoli of the East, Terablus is a city in northern Lebanon of our time. And here we'll go down and we'll see that the first question that comes up is this question. And he tells about the problems that he had with people getting to prayer at the right time. על כן גזרתי אומר לחדש כלי השעות הנקרא אורולוג'יו, ולקובעו בחצר בית הכנסת או בחוץ, ושוב לא יהיה להם מענה להשיב. They won't have anything to answer once this clock reminds them continuously of what time it is. So the Gabaim agreed that this was a good idea. And he says, Ach bazot nafsham lish'ol higia, but they raised the question. Im yechulim liten zog, meaning a bell, hamekashkesh hashaot, that hits, reverberates with the hours, yan, sheba bate kenesiot hanotzrim yesh sha'a, meaning sha'on, what we call a clock, im zog hamekashkesh, with a bell that strikes, leida hashaot, kemo sheyesh babatim u'berechovot kiryah. It's not only on the churches. Other places in the city also have this, and some people have this in their private homes. Ve'im she'ein bazeh avodah, this is not part of the religious services of the Christians to have these clocks. Im kol zeh sha'ol yishalu, nevertheless they're asking, im yesh bazeh mishum lo telchu bechukot hagoyim, shouldn't go and follow the ways of the goyim, or lo, al hakol, yorenu amoreh tzedakah, please instruct us, Rabbi, mishpat hakeli shaot hazeh, how this fits according to halacha, ve'yavos zecharo kaful min hashamayim, he will be doubly rewarded from heaven. And he says that to go into this whole issue from Abi Initzio, from the beginning, it's too long. You can write a book about this, or several books. And therefore, he says, let's start from the well-known Teshuvah that has summed up the position on this issue. Teshuvat HaGaon Moreh Av Rabbi Yosef Kulon Zichro L'Chayei Olam Haba B'Teshuvah Siman Pei Chet. In response, from 88 of Rabbi Yosef Kulon, who was one of the Rishonim. He lived in northern Italy. He died in 1460, I believe. And this, the notion, the topic that was dealt with, he teshuvat heter levishat hakappa shel kohanei hanotzrim, to permit Jews to wear the kappa, which is a cape, a garment, shel kohanei hanotzrim, of the Christian priests, Christian religious priests. Now, actually, it's a bit less direct than that. Okay, if you were in Italy and you went to university and you learned medicine, or you studied medicine under someone else and you reached the highest level, you could wear a certain item of clothing which was very striking and impressive, and everybody who saw you wearing that would know that you are a top expert doctor, and therefore you could get very good pay and high respect and so on. But the problem was that it's not the medical school in Italy that invented what type of garment indicates high rank, and they got the idea from the Roman Catholic Church. Of course, the Roman Catholic Church ultimately didn't get it from Jesus, who didn't wear these very splendid clothing. They got it from the Roman senators and nobility. Be that as it may, it came through the church and now was adapted also for the clothing of medical practitioners of a high rank. And a Jew wanted to know, could he wear that garment, the kappa, the cape, indicating his status as a master physician? And Rabbi Yosef Kulon wrote a lengthy teshuvah on this topic, And he said, this is sort of the summary, the bottom line of that discussion. נראה לעניות דעתי פשוט, it seems simple to me, דלא לאסור משום לא תלכו בחוקות הגויים. This is not forbidden because of חוקות הגויים, אלא, because the only reason that we couldn't have for forbidding something under the category of חוקות הגויים is one of two possibilities, אחד משני חלקים. האחד הוא, one possibility, הדבר אשר אין טעמו נגלה כדמשמע לשון חוק, וכדפירוש רש"י בפירוש החומש, שאין להם טעם לדבר. Okay, we typically speak about חוקים ומשפטים, and the difference between these two classically is that mishpatim are rules or norms that we know what the reason or the rationale behind them is, and chukim are those laws or rules of Torah, of halach, that we don't know what the reason is. Like the classic example, right, is para aduma. Now, some would say, well, we don't know the reason for the chok. There must be some reason. As far as we're concerned, we don't know it, and therefore we just obey even without knowing the reason. But the classical, so chok doesn't have any justification, any rational justification. It's simply, that's the rule. And similarly, chokot hagoyim is rules held by the goyim for which there's absolutely no rationale per se, except that's how things have to be done. Okay, ועניין השני אשר יש לאסור משום חוקות הגויים לפי עניות דעתי הוא הדבר אשר שייך בו. The second reason for classifying something as forbidden under the rubric of חוקות הגויים הוא הדבר אשר שייך בו נדנו בפריצת גדר הצניעות והענווה ונהגו בו הגויים. Okay, behavior which is radically improper and overtly goes against the grain of values of tzniut and so on that we hold can also be forbidden under the rubric of chukot hagoyim. Okay, just a minute, I went down too much. Sorry. Okay, and therefore, what does he say? We're going now to the other slide here. Okay, and he summarizes more and more. And the conclusion is, חוץ משתי דרכים הללו מותר ללך בדרכיהם. Any practice of the goyim that is not connected to some aspect of their religion, which is absolutely opaque even to them. They don't know what the rationale is. That's how it should be done. Or it's something which goes against the grain of propriety and modesty in our tradition. חוץ משתי דרכים הללו מותר ללך בדרכיהם. Anything else that they're going to do that doesn't fall under these two categories, we, the Jews, can feel fully free to act in the exact same way that they're going to act. יען שהוא דבר השווה לכל נפש אדם, because this is something in which the souls or the persona of all human beings are equal, ונצרך להם, and they all need this one. רצוני לומר, לכל בריות מעשה בראשית, this is something which all creatures, all human creatures, need and are attuned to, and it's meaningful to them. ונכללים בהם ישראלים ואומות העולם. Okay, so what's happening here is that he is pointing out that unlike what some people might think, that there's a binary opposition on the one side, Goyim, on the one other side, Jews. No, there is a third category, which is most of everything, which is an overlap, which is human beings. Okay, so in certain extreme cases, the Goyim are Goyim and we can't behave like them, and we are Jews and we're different, but basically there's a large common middle, okay, of Kol Beriot Maaseh Bereshit, all human creatures, v'nichlalim b'hem Yisraelim ve'umot ha'olam. Okay, so this is a statement which, as far as I recall, Rabbi Yosef Kulon himself doesn't phrase it that way, but this is the overall generalization that Rabbi Yisrael Moshe Chazan derives from the Teshuvah of Rabbi Kulon. And then he says, okay, so let's see what is now meaning, what does this all mean for the question before us, which is the question of the clock, right? So he says, look, the reason that churches have clocks, and by the way, it's not only churches, is because they are public buildings, and in the public buildings, they provide this timepiece, which declares the hour by a certain type of bell for the public good. That's the reason the churches built this. He said, now he says, they have a different type of bell, which is not part of the mechanical arrangement of the clock. It's a bell that they pull by ropes and they ring the bells, and those bells originally were installed in order to call all the people together, but meanwhile have come to have religious significance. He says, אבל באותו של כלי השעות שאין בו שום אחד מהניתרתי טעמי, but the clock itself is not a religious praxis or object, and it's not something which goes against the grain of propriety or modesty that people should know what time it is. And then he says, ואפילו היו תנאקות של כלי השעות לאסוף העם לבית תפילתם, even let's say that they had installed the clock in the church. Why? So that people would know what time it is and they could come to the service in the church. Im kol zot mutar. Nevertheless, it would be permitted for us to do that. Why? Chada, de'enu chok va'avoda ki im zeruz la'av lavo likrat Elohav. This, even if they had installed the clock to get people to know when to come to church, it's not really part of the church service. It's just a way to get them to come there. Vezot shenit, and there's a second reason. Keivan de la Yisraeli haoseh u'ta'amo yadua v'nigle. When we, the Jews, now want to install such a clock in our Bet Knesset, is it a chok that we don't know why it's happening? We know exactly. There's a rationale. The rationale is transparent. Okay, טעמו ידוע ונגלה שהישראלי אינו עושה להתדמות ואינו דבר תמוה. We're not doing it in order to imitate the goyim. It's not something strange and opaque. שהרי יש לו טעם מפורסם. It has a clear and obvious reason. והוא כי כל שכונת בית הכנסת העניים והאביונים ידעו השעה. All the people who can't afford to have a clock of their own, but the Jews who live in that area ידעו השעה, they'll know what time it is, ויצא האדם לפועלו וכדומה, ודאי אין לפקפק. If people will use it, they'll only to come to services, they'll know when it's time to go to work, and it's a public service, and it has nothing to do with something that is forbidden because it has no time and no reason. Okay. ועוד ראיה שאם כלי המכה שעות אינו דת קבועה להם, how else can we also know that it's not something that's inherently part of their religious practice? שהרי כמה בתי כנסיות שלהם אין להם כלי מכה שעות ולא מורה שעות. Some have a clock, some don't. So it's not obviously part of their religious practice to have these clocks ringing the hours. אלא ודאי דמה שהוא קבע בכנסיות המפורסמות. Why do they, yes, have clocks in the main churches? היינו לטובת הכללי, וכאמור, it's a public service and it's not an act of opaque religious practice. Okay. And therefore, then he says, well, is it pritzaat gederat tzniut? Is this something immodest? He says, no, there's nothing immodest about it. שעניין כזה אין לו ריח שחץ וגאווה. This has nothing to do with pride and overweening immodesty. שאפילו עני המתפרס מן הצדקה יכול להיות לו בביתו וחומותיו כלי מכה שעות כזה. Even people who aren't rich can, if they want to, buy such a clock. ועוד, furthermore, שאם אתה בא לאוסרו, if you want to say that it's forbidden, צריך אתה לאוסרו גם לישראלי הפשוט להיות בביתו ובחומותיו כלי מכה שעות, כיוון שהוא שחץ וגאווה. Okay, so, okay, if you say that having a clock somehow expresses something which is immodest, inappropriate, and goyish, that we Jews don't want to do things with this quality. So first of all, we have to say that people can't have clocks in their own house. And only then could we come and say, well, if people don't have it in their houses, can the public establish such? And the ein tzibur ani, typically we don't impose strictures on the public, which we might impose on individuals. Okay. And then he says, okay, so it's basically, it's mutar. Right? He says, but let's say somebody would tell us that nevertheless, with all due respect, people who don't know otherwise would point out, and it's really the case, that after all, the bells sound very much like the bells of a church, and the church bells are part of their religious practice, and therefore, even though ostensibly there's nothing wrong with it, the very fact that it's similar to what the Goyim do, it should be inappropriate for us. Okay, so now we will respond and say, שמלבד שאם כל מה שכתבנו לעיל תנתק ותמוש גם טענה הזאת, שהרי לפי כל העמו, there's no ground to hold with this idea that inherently it has a good reason. And it's not something that's immodest or extrovert. So what's wrong with it? שהרי לפי כל האמור, כל דבר שאינו חוק בלי טעם, something that is rational, מה שאני עושה, אני מותר בו, אף שלהם הדבר הזה עצמו הוא חוק בלי טעם בעבודה. Let's say the Goyim would be doing something, and they don't know why they're doing it. It's just that their ancestors kept doing it. Okay? Their ancestors kept whenever they went to church, they would take a toothpick and would clean their teeth. They do that, and they don't know why they're doing it in church. That's how we've been doing it for 1,000 years. And now I, as a Jew, had the idea that I would like to use a toothpick after I eat to make sure my teeth are clean. Just a minute, the goyim are doing it. Okay, but I'm not doing it for the same reason. מה שאני עושה, אני מותר בו, I'm allowed to do it. אף שלהם הדבר הזה עצמו הוא חוק בליתם בעבודה, it's an act of religious worship for them, וכיוון שהישראל עושהו מטעם ההכרחי אשר בו גלוי לכל העמים, since the Jewish person is not doing it for the same reason that they're doing it. The Jewish person is doing it for a reason. He can give you a good reason that's absolutely transparent and clear. Tu lo mashgihinan be'avodatam. At this point, we disregard the fact that they're doing it for some strange reason of their own that they don't even know why, and for them it's a chok. But we're now doing it not as a chok, but for some very good rationale that we can give. And he says, you know what? You might say that this is like matzeva, okay? In parentheses, the matzeva was an upright stone that people used to set up and worship God via or at the site of that stone. And we have the avot doing it, okay, all the time. And then later on in the Torah, it says that we shouldn't have a matzeva asher saneh Hashem Elohecha, that God hates it. And the rabbis explain, well, originally God didn't hate it because that's why the avot did it. But later on, the goyim adopted it. Once the goyim adopted it, we have to desist. Okay. And he says, okay, so, but let's say he says that, just a minute, where did I? Okay, let's say that we're not allowed to worship God via this block of stone. He says, but לא נאסרה לבנות מצבה כדי לשב עליה וכיוצא מאיזה דברים. Let's say I wanted to take a block of stone, looks just like the מצבה that the goyim use, and I use it as a bench to sit on in my garden. He says, okay, that's fine. I'm taking something that looks like the same object, using it for a different purpose, which is not anything to do with religion. And I know why I'm doing it. Everybody can see why I'm doing it. I'm using it as a bench in my garden. He says, לא נאסרה לבנות מצבה כדי לשב עליה. Okay, and therefore he says the fact that the goyim use it, and even if they were to be using these church clocks in their religion, it wouldn't be forbidden to us to do that. Okay, and what's more, it's not something that only the Christians do in their churches. There's public buildings with such clocks. Everyone around the world has such clocks. Since it's not something that is unique and special for the Christian religion, אנו משתמשים ממש באותו כלי כדמותו, ואפילו ביד, ואפילו כלי שיעור הקאות, כאותו פעמון העבודה. Let's say that we would have a clock, and the clock would have attached to it bells, and they're not like what's usually in a mechanical clock, big bells like they have in the church, and this clock, when the hour came, would strike giant bells, just like church bells. He says, mutar, כיוון דלאו מעבודתם כגמרינן, אלא מעלמא גמרינן. The idea of having such a machine, a mechanical clock, with reverberating bells to tell what time it is not something that we are adopting from the Christian religion. Rather, we are following a logic which is clear to the entire world when we're learning it from humanity in general. And he says, you know what? This idea is also found in a responsum of Bach. Beit Chadash, it's Rabbi Yoel Sirkis, who lived in Europe, an Ashkenazic rabbi. And he said, he was asked, שנשאל על מה שמזמרים ומנגנים בבתי כנסיות במוסיקה שמנגנים ומזמרים בבית תפילתם. Now, as we'll see immediately, it's not the case that Jews were one-to-one adopting the exact compositions that were being used in churches. Rather, the type of musical modes that the Jews were using in the synagogue was the same type of musical mode, same type of melodies, same type of harmonies and whatever that the Goyim were using in the churches. That's what the Bach was asked about. כתב, דאין אוסר אלא דווקא באותם הניגונים שהם מיוחדים לגויים, מאחר שהוא חוק לעבודה זרה. In other words, what we are forbidden to do, the Bach, Rabbi Chadash, Rabbi Yoel Sirkis says, is to take a musical composition exactly that's used in church, a Bach, chorale, or whatever, and use it in our Bet Knesset. We can't do that because that's a chok לעבודה זרה. אבל אם אינם מיוחדים, if we use tunes that are similar to the type that's used in churches but not identical, נראה דאין בזה איסור. Because we can say and such, we didn't learn it, this specific tune from the church. We learned it because that's the type of tunes that people in general think is appropriate for these type of activities. So really at this point, Rav Israel Moshe Chazan has solved the problem. The problem was, can we have such a bell tower clock in our synagogue for reasons of getting the people to come on time? And the answer is yes. It is not. It's not a chok. It's rational. Everybody does it. The Christians, when they do it, they don't do it for religious reasons, for practical public reasons. And it's a similarity to the sound of a bell per se is not something that renders it asur. So at this point, we can all go home because the question is solved. But to a certain extent, this whole question, Rav Yisrael Moshe Chazan is using as a setup to really proceed further and give us certain insights and positions of his that are not connected to the clocks. And he says, בעיקר דינו של הבח ז"ל בעניין המוסיקה הנ"ל, you know what Rabbi Yoel Sirkis said about the music, that we can use music of the same type as church music, but we can't really take the exact same tunes from the church. You know what? הואיל ועתה לידן נעימה בי מילתא. Since it's come up, let's say something about that. Now, obviously, this is when it came up. He brought it up, right? When he brought it up, he knew why he was bringing it up, because he wants now to talk about that. And what does he want to say? Remember, what did the Bach say? The exact tune from the church we can't use, but we can use tunes of similar quality and melodic arrangement. with asking great pardon from the holiness of the Bach, Rabbi Yoel Sirkis, לאדם מעניין המוזיקה, אפילו המיוחדת לעבודתם לעניין המצבה. המצבה is אסור because it's something arbitrary which the Goyim took, and now if we use it, it's also going to be arbitrary. He says, but that's not the same as music. בבישלמה בעניין מצבה הייתה חוק לאבותינו, לעבוד את השם בזה. ובעת היה בלא טעם וסברה גופה. כי אם כך בחרו האבות בייחוד לעבודת השם. Why did the אבות דווקא worship God by setting up these blocks of stone? Is there something in a block of stone which especially symbolizes God in a very clear way? No, it was an arbitrary convention. ואם כן שחזרו הכנענים וכבר החוק לעבודה זרה, the goyim, the Canaanim, now took this exact same opaque, incomprehensible mode of worship, and they took it for עבודה זרה. הנה חינם נאסרה לישראל דחזר חוק בלותם לכנענים. Okay, because that's what chok means, is something that we don't know. We don't know the reason. And really, if we really want to worship God, why do we have to use dafka that? We could worship God otherwise. Kimo al gabe habama. Okay, in biblical times, before the temple in Jerusalem, it was permitted to have bamot, small sanctuaries, or al gabe amizbeach in Jerusalem. וכיוצא כיוון דלק הטעם עצמי במצבה יותר משאר האופנים. Right? So if people would say, well, if the Goyim took the matzeva, how are we going to worship God? Baruch Hashem, there's many other possibilities. Okay. But he says, you'll see that while the matzeva, which was adopted by the Goyim, was forbidden to us, the same didn't happen with the main core forms of worship that were in vogue at that time. Sacrifices, to bring a good scent up to God. And that's the reason why the korbanot is to create this of barbecued meat, wonderful smell. וגם בשאר הקורבנות נוסף להם מתנות כהונה. There's reason for the... ואלו וכיוצא אלו לא נאסרו, ולא חזרו שנואים מפני שהיו מקריבים קורבנות וכיוצא לעבודה זרה. He says, now, actually, the עבודה זרה had many forms of worship. Did God forbid us to use all of the forms of worship that the Goyim had? No. It can't be that everything that they're going to do, even if it has a certain rationale, and according to that rationale, we understand why it's appropriate for the service of God, Avodat Hashem, to use that. The fact that they're going to do it is not a reason to deny it to us. Okay. Music is like korbanot in ancient times. Shehu guf ha'avodah. Music is a core part of worship. What does that mean? With our souls submitting themselves to God in a pleasant tune. גילה ורעדה יותן להוד והדה בבית אלוהינו. This atmosphere is created and maintained by music. ואם הקול הזה אשר מנגנים בבית תפילתם של אומות העולם הוא קול ההכנעה הנכנס אל הלב לפי משקל המוזיקה, לפי מה שהורגל בו, let's say that the type of music, the exact specific music that's used in churches really works. It really makes a strong impression on the religious experience. By the way, that's why the Goyim are doing it, right? And this is necessary for the proper religious experience. היאמן כי יסופר כי בשביל שוטים שקלקלו קבעו בבית תפילתם, could it be possible to imagine that because the Goyim took this wonderful music and are using it in their church, נאסר אנחנו בדבר שטבענו מחייב, we will now be forbidden for our religious experience to be enhanced by this wonderful music, כי הוא אחד מחמישה חושים שהגוף נהנה מהם, because this is one of the five senses which influence our experience. ומה ישנה מחוש הטעם וחוש הריח, והוא עניין הקורבנות והקטורת גופי ודלא נאסרו. Oh, he said, sensual experience was part and parcel of the temple service, korbanot uketoret, and God didn't forbid them to us because the goyim are doing it. Why was that? משום שאין אדם שליט ברוח הטבעי אשר יד כל אדם שווה בו. There is a certain aspect of human experience which is basic to all humans. All humans are moved and impressed and get experience from certain senses, sensual experiences. אם כן הוא הדין והוא הטעם בחוש השמע והניגון שכל אדם שווה בו, also human beings are moved by music. וכבר הנתבע בטבעו אשר לא ייכנע לבוא הערל אם לא משמוע קולות המוזיקה אשר הוקבעו למוכנעים והורגלו במדינתו, which music affects us. The music that in the culture we live in, we associate and have been taught from early age and inculcated from the surrounding culture that this type of music is sad music, and this type of music is martial music, and this type of music is sublime music, and this is במדינתו איש לאיש יולד בה, ואלו משברים ליבו ואלו זולתם. Which music affects us how? It's the cultural convention in which we grew up. האם יוכל האיש הישראלי האיטלקי דרך משל? Can, for instance, an Italian Jewish person להפוך טבעו בטבע הנקנה מארץ מולדתו? Can he now go against the grain of the musical culture in which he grew up in Italy? ללך לבית הכנסת ולהיכנע, and he will be religiously, positively affected מקולות השומעם בכל יום בתיאטראות ובקרקסאות וברחובות קריה. Let's say we say, okay, we can't use the music from the churches. What can we use? Well, let's take something from the theater. Let's take something from the circus. Let's take something from the popular street music. זה לא עלה לב אנוש. ולטעמי של הרב בית חדש ז"ל, if the idea is that anything that the Christians or the Goyim use as a sensual part of their divine service, we can't use it. למה לא נאסור הבדלה בכוס של יין על גבי התיבה? מאחר שגם בבתי כנסייותיהם מברכים על הכוס יין נסתם. So obviously there are certain things that even if they're going to do it, we do it. They do it in their divine service, and we do it in our divine service. Why? Because it works. אלא ודאי כמו שאמרנו, זה דבר טבעי, something that's natural ונצרך לכל אומה, and every nation experiences this type of music in this way. היי בדיני והי באמונתו, but each one uses this type of music, which is religious music, music which in this culture gives you a sublime or intense or devout religious experience. Each person in that culture will use the same type of music, each one in their religious services. If you would now come to forbid using the vocabulary, the musical vocabulary and the musical modes and the type of music that works in this culture as religious music, you won't be able to really maintain life in a proper way. And then he says, ושוב האיר השם את עיניי ומצאתי הדבר מפורש כבעתה בקודך בגדול אדוננו הרמב"ם בספר המורה חלק ג' סוף פרק מ"ז, it's פרק מ"ו, and we'll see that in a moment, but first note what he's doing. In order to argue a point of halakha about what's asur and what's mutar in our religious activities, and to say that this is somehow common or can be common to the Jews and the non-Jews, he's saying that this is something that you'll see from learning the Moreh HaNevuchim. And just a minute. Now I have to switch to here. Oh, and here is an edition of Moreh HaNevuchim. And as you know, in the part 3 of Moreh HaNevuchim, the Rambam says he's going to explain the rationale and the meaning of what was going on in the Bet Midrash. And inter alia, the Rambam says, how is it possible that God in the temple permitted the use or advocated the use of wine? But on, and that's why I'm showing you this one, the commentator Shem Tov ben Yosef ben Shem Tov, who died in 1493, a year after the expulsion, in his commentary says, אבל הקרבת היין אמר הרב שהוא נבוך, איך ציווה להקריבו, וכבר היו עובדי עבודה זרה מקריבים אותו. So the Rambam can't explain why wine is permitted. כבר אמרתי לך טעם השולחן. Shem Tov says, I already explained to you why there was a table inside Bet HaMikdash with bread. וגם כן אותו הטעם ראוי שיינתן ביין. This is the same rationale that works for the table, works for the wine. כי כל העבודה שיעבדו בו המלך ראוי שיעבוד השם הנכבד. And here, we look here, in chapter 45, the previous chapter of Moreh HaNevuchim, Rambam says what? About the Shulchan. השולחן והיות הלחם עליו תמיד לא אדע לו סיבה. ואיני יודע איזו סיבה אייחס אותו עד היום. Rambam says, I can't understand the rationale why there's a table with bread in Bet HaMikdash, inside with the menorah, right? And Mizbach HaZahav, HaKetoret, the same room of Kodesh was a shulchan. Oh, Amar Shem Tov. Here's the explanation of Shem Tov. מה שנראה לי בזה כשם יתברך ציווה לעשות בית כבית מלך. The whole construction of Bet HaMikdash was for why? God doesn't need it. Who needs it? We. It's for our religious experience that God made this whole construction. And this construction follows the theme of the palace of a king. ובבית מלך יימצאו כל אלו הדברים אשר אמרנו, אנשים שישמרו את היכליו. You are people standing guard in the palace of a king and in the mikdash. ואנשים שיעבדו בעבודות המיוחדות למלך, people doing the service appropriate to the king. לתקן מאכליו ולעשות כל שאר הדברים הצריכים למלך. For preparing the food and everything. Who's that? The Kohanim that are bringing korbanot. ויש אנשים אחרים ששוררו לפניו בכל יום תמיד בשירה נאה וכל זמרה. There are other people who sing to the king because the king likes music. Who's that? לוויים. ויש בבית המלך מקום אחד מוכן לעשות מאכל. There's a place for food. ויש גם כן מקום להקטיר לפניו קטורת בשמים. In the palace, there's wonderful smells of ketoret, and that's also in the mikdash. ויש שולחן בביתו, there's a table. ויש גם כן מקום מוכן אשר בו יושב המלך, a place where the king sits, אשר לא ייכנס אדם שם, כי אם המשנה לו ואוהביו עד מאוד. Only very special people can come and actually enter the chamber where the king is. וכן רצה השם שיהיה בביתו מכל אלו הדברים אשר לא יחסר לו ממלכי האדמה, אף כי הוא מלך גדול נורא על כל העמים. Okay, God doesn't really need this. He is a supreme being, a supreme king that doesn't need this. But what? All of these things were fashioned in order to create the impression of a king's palace. כמו שאמר מקדש השם כוננו ידיך, השם ימלוך לעולם ועד. The מקדש, the Shem Tov, is in order for God to be experienced as a king. כי זה הבית יפרסם מלכותו גדולתו, ולכן ציווה בכל אלו הדברים, והבן זה כי הוא נפלא. Okay, so the whole construction of the mikdash is in order to provide human beings with a certain type of experiences that will make upon them the feeling that this is an incredible religious experience of the great king. Okay, and now he says, and so he goes into this, and he says that, okay, so from this discussion we learn two good things. Gam ta'am hayayin, right? Why is there wine in the mikdash? Because kings had wine in their palaces. Vegam ta'am hashir. Why was there music in the mikdash? Because this was part of the sensory experience and wonderful feeling created by music that kings had, and therefore it's also in Beit HaMikdash. דלא נאסר לעבוד את השם כי אם בחוקותיהם שומעים בלא טעמה. Which things that going to do are forbidden to us? Things that they do that have no good rationale. אבל כל דבר שהוא מילתא בטעם הראוי שנעבוד את השם הנכבד אדרבה כמוהם ויותר מהם. So, okay, I think we've reached our time limit. So I'll sum up by saying that you see that, first of all, Rabbi Yisrael Moshe Chazan has followed the Yosef Kulon by saying that Chukot HaGoyim means only things which have no good rationale or are somehow strikingly against the grain of morality and modesty. And Klok is neither of these. Furthermore, he says, the whole issue of music in a religious setting is to create a certain powerful religious experience, and therefore, a powerful musical experience is culture bound. In a certain culture, certain types of music create certain types of experiences. Other types of music create other kind of experiences, and it's not the same in culture A and culture B. But in culture A, the Jews and the non-Jews have the same sensibilities. And therefore, if music works, and a certain type of music works, the fact that the Goyim use it in their divine service is for a very clear reason, to create a certain type of powerful religious experience. That being the case, okay, ראוי שנעבוד את השם הנכבד כמוהם ויותר מהם. We can use the same and should use the same type of music because the goal is clear, it's rational, it's empirically part of that culture, this kind of music, and therefore, if the Goyim use it in their divine service, we can and should use it in ours. Okay, that's for now, and I suppose now that if perhaps anybody wants to raise questions or comments, we should
Thank you, Professor.
be able to do that.
Thank you so much, Professor. I'm going to look at some questions in the chat. I mean, for me, it's very interesting because it seems to be that the Hacham is able to acknowledge that there are some primal drives that human beings have, or primal preferences, that it's not something Christian or Islamic or Hindu or Buddhist. It's just that primal drive for certain music that can provide religious awe. And there is no need to have it labeled Christian or Islamic or this or that. It is a human reality. And for that reason, there's no reason why we shouldn't absorb that and, bring it into our own avodah. So thank you for that. I'm just going to look into the chat. If anyone wants to ask a question by actually unmuting, please do so. Otherwise, do leave your question in the chat. Anybody got a question?
Yeah, I do.
Yes.
Mr. Garson.
Yes, Rabbi, Professor, I'm very concerned by Rab Shem Tov ben Shem Tov explanation for the Shulchan and the Yayin, because if the whole purpose of the exercise is to emulate a king's palace in all its glory, where's the bedroom, which is one of the main areas of the king? It becomes a nonsense to actually attribute the Rambam's inexplicable analysis of these particular activities to copying a king's palace.
Okay, so first of all, that might be an interesting critique of Shem Tov, and by extension, of course, the whole idea that a temple is needed with a lot of gold and marble and a tremendous investment and hundreds of animals on korbanot. I mean, and the Levim standing and singing there and so on. Okay, so in a certain sense, and I can see that I'm not arguing, this is a broader critique of the whole need for a mikdash. Okay, and well, you know that Rambam himself says that korbanot and so on were a concession to the religious sensibilities at that time. And just like it was unimaginable to them at that time that you don't need the korbanot, you can just pray by voice and words. And the Rambam says, but for the same similarity, we're used to praying with words. And if somebody were to come and say to us that you can just worship God by meditation, that would seem equally incredible to us.
You have, to me, Rabbi, you have, for example, what I understand was a very Jewish habit of actually prostrating yourself on the ground for prayer. We don't have this anymore. This is forbidden now. We only do it once a year, on Kippur.
Yes, but it's probably forbidden.
Is it Chukat Goy now?
Well, as you know, as you may recall, actually the son of the Rambam, Avraham ben Rambam, advocated that this was the original correct practice followed by all of the prophets and all of the great religious Jews of ancient times. And in his time, he says, the Sufis learned those practices somehow from the ancient original Jewish religion, and Jews should readopt it. Okay, so he would say that in Achinami, this is a very, now, I must say that when I, on Yom Kippurim, I happen to have written, by the way, an article about Seder HaAvodah, okay, but when I, on Yom Kippurim, prostrate myself subjectively, okay, it's a very powerful religious experience.
Yeah, I agree.
Right? So the reason that we don't do that is interesting. I don't know how it developed, and some people say, well, it's because the Christians did it. But there's a lot of other things the Christians did. For instance, they use wine. We use wine in our services. We don't use Christian wine, but we use wine. Wine is very prevalent in Kiddush, Havdalah, Berit, Chuppah. So certain things we have maintained, and so the idea that sensory experiences are important aspects of our religious life is something that I think that in some ways we can acknowledge, even if some of us are more rationalistically inclined. And this is something that Rabbi Israel Moshe Chazan is pushing. He says the sensory aspect of human life can and should be involved in the divine service of God.
Thank you, Rabbi. Thank you.
If I could add as well, I mean, I prostrate much to my wife's shock when she sees me pray. And I know a lot of Yemenites do. There's actually a recent picture of the Rishon LeZion was in Dubai to meet the new Yemenites that had emigrated to Dubai. And he's sitting there watching the Yemenite community that had just emigrated prostrate. So still to this day, you have those, obviously, you still follow Nisach Rambam doing so. And there are, of course, a lot of Christians these days, unfortunately, actually wearing tefillin. It's becoming more and more popular.
They believe that that's what Jesus did, so
indeed,
they have to do it also.
So it's going to be very interesting to see what happens if that becomes a norm, just like some groups stole prostration from us. If they steal tefillin from us, does that mean we stop wearing tefillin? Chas Shalom. Gidon, I see you've got your hands up.
Yes, thank you. Hi. Thank you for the shiur. So from my understanding, Chukat HaGoyim is primarily based on the two Gemaras, one in Sanhedrin and one in Avodah Zarah, right? Broadly speaking. So does the Chacham in his Teshuvah discuss the seeming contradiction between the two? Because the Gemara in Sanhedrin seems to be mashma that that there needs to be some sort of basis in Tanakh for us doing a practice that the Goyim did, like with the specific example is the burning of the funeral pyre of the king. So the Gemara there says you can do it because it's in Tanakh. Whereas it seemed that if what the Chacham is saying, that you would be able to do it because of other reasons, not because it's in Tanakh. Whereas the Gemara felt the need to use that that you used to use that explanation of why it's allowed. So does he discuss that, or does the professor have maybe some sort of understanding of what he would say to that?
I do think that he alludes to that, but taking you up on that issue, of course, music was in Tanakh. Okay, the whole Bet HaMikdash was full of music, instrumental music and vocal music. So you really don't have to. There's no problem with the Gemara in Sanhedrin to enable music, right? And the question is then, okay, which kind of music? And then he would say, well, the music that works in a certain culture and time is the music that would be appropriate to use in Jewish religious services. And the fact that Goyim also have, because they all live in Italy or all live in Arab countries, so they have different makamot, but if they live in Turkey, then they have other kind of makamot, because in Turkey, it's a different type of musical. And the Jews in Turkey, they have the same type of musical scale that the non-Jews in Turkey have. And then if you go to Morocco, so they have the Andalusian music, which I'm told that the kings used to invite people like Rav Chaim Luk, who now lives in Jerusalem, a wonderful, amazing person, to perform, because the Jews had a wonderful command of the Andalusian musical tradition, which the Moroccan Muslims really appreciated as the greatest music.
So according to what the professor is saying, could it be said, and maybe I'm very off base here, that the music in the Beit HaMikdash was not some sort of essentially holy or correct music, but it was more of a reflection of some amalgamation of original Jewish thought mixed with the music of the surrounding peoples, and that was what was used in the Beit HaMikdash, according to the professor or the Chacham.
Well, first of all, I understand that that's a very interesting historical question, right? What was the music used in Beit HaMikdash? But it doesn't seem to be the case that the Leviim had special type of musical instruments that they invented ex nihilo and were not in use among the Babylonian, the Assyrians, or the local people like Nevel, Kinor, and so on. And it says, Hu haya avi kol ochez Nevel v'Kinor, who's that? That's a goy, right? So, Tuval Kain, right? So Goyim invented music, and the Jews were part of this. Now, it's to be assumed that there were composers, right, that created music for the Leviim, but did they do this in a musical scales or style that was completely alien to everything else in the world? So Rabbi Moshe Chazan would say probably not, because it would work and get the spiritual effect only if it was resonating with the experiences that people had were growing up and becoming involved in all different types of activities. And that's where people get their musical sensibilities from. So that's what I assume Rabbi Moshe Chazan would say.
Thank you.
Thank you. Gary, welcome. Good to see you. Go ahead.
Hi, thanks. So I just wanted to ask a quick question, not necessarily about the source we were just looking at, which was very interesting, but I guess there's a slight correlation. I wanted to ask about Kinat Zion, which Rabbi Chacham Yisrael Moshe Chazan wrote, and whether or not the professor is able to comment on its effectiveness in producing a kind of a universal declaration against the Brunswick Conference and some of the decisions that were made there, or whether the language employed, and I've only looked at it, I had a cursory look at it, but it seemed to me that it may not have achieved what it set out to achieve, maybe because the language was not aimed at certain types of Jews, but more aimed at rabbis in order to encourage them to speak out against it. I don't know if the professor can speak about that, if he's got any kind of thoughts about that.
Well, in the case at hand, do I understand that you are maintaining that this entire attitude that Rabbi Yisrael Moshe Chazan is advocating in this teshuvah is in order to serve some extraneous political purpose vis-a-vis the goyim?
No.
Okay, so I didn't understand.
No, I was looking at the language in Kinat Zion, and I understand why it's written, and I understand the signatures that there was everyone who signed it, including the father of Chacham Gagin as well. And the question is, with regards to attitudes towards modernity and looking through the prism, the miskeret of halacha, and making sure that these things are, though the work of Kinat Zion specifically written against the sort of burgeoning reform movement, was that language ever going to achieve what it set out to achieve? Is my question. Like
in other words, okay, I didn't understand. In other words, you're saying that Rabbi Yisrael Moshe Chazan was a participant in activities of rabbis at the time against the reform movement. I don't recall now the exact thing, but there was very harsh language employed. And well, first of all, I haven't studied the language, and I certainly don't know whether it was efficient. In many cases, also today, people that make such proclamations or use such language really don't hope to influence the opponent. They hope to have an effect upon their own public to feel very strongly against whatever it is that they're against. And you see this in many cases. But so that's a good question, but I would prefer to focus on the issues that are raised in this teshuvah, which in a certain sense you could say is antithetical to the content of this. And as you may recall, the early reformers that wanted to use instrumental music in a synagogue, which of course on Shabbat, which of course they wanted it to be performed by a goy. The goy, a non-Jew, would come and play the musical instruments in the synagogue on Shabbat. And they turned to rabbis in Italy. This was before Rabbi Yisrael Moshe Chazan was there, but they turned to rabbis in Italy, who gave them a teshuvah that yes, you could do that, because the fact that there were instrumental music in synagogues on Yom Hol had been done, for instance, in Prague, but They used it in Kabbalat Shabbat, which was before the sunset. And then immediately before Mizmor Shir Yom HaShabbat, they wheeled out this musical instrument, and they continued only with vocal music on the Shabbat service. So the use of Kli Negina in the synagogue itself, there were precedents. And then they pointed out there were precedents for Jews to invite, if you know that, okay, a baby is born on Shabbat. Yirtzeh Hashem, 8 days now, Shabbat is going to be a celebration. So the various communities, it's a Devar Mitzvah, you could invite a Gentile troupe of musicians under certain thing, the contract, where you could have Goyim Shabbat do things, and they would play music at the Brit or at the Sheva Berachot on Shabbat. And some rabbis in Italy said, okay, therefore, since there's a precedent for using musical instruments and there's a precedent for Goyim playing musical instruments on Shabbat for the benefit of Jewish mitzvot, you could do that in a synagogue on Shabbat. What happened was ultimately that whatever avenue the early reformers, who at that point were not yet inclined to go against halakha outright, so whatever way they suggested, well, let's justify it this way, let's justify it that way, and so on, and then they got the answer, forget it, hadash asur min Torah. And therefore, ultimately, after about 20 years, they were very frustrated that they had this convention in Braunschweig, and they said, no, the Talmudic halakha doesn't obligate us. But was it necessary to reach that point? It could be that you say, well, you know, we don't really appreciate this teshuvah of the Italian rabbis. We don't do that. We won't do that in our synagogue. But if you really want to do that and you have it, no, do it. And then who knows if the reform would have gotten to the point of saying that the Talmudic halakha doesn't obligate us. So there's a certain chicken and egg here, which.
Thank you.
Thank you, Raf. Thank you. I mean, you're now almost midnight in Israel, so I don't want to take any more of your time, Professor. Thank you so much, and thank you everyone for being here. We look forward to continuing part 2 in a couple of weeks' time. Next week, we have Rav Yitzchak Berdugo of Miami. He will be giving us a shiur on Hacham Yosef Meshash and going through some of his the principles in his teshuvot, so we're very excited for that. Professor Hacham, thank you so much again.
Okay, Laila Tov.
Looking forward to seeing you soon.
Boker Tov, wherever you are. And
Indeed.
see you in 2 weeks' time.
See you then. Thank you, everybody. Good night.